Hello, class. I'm here today to talk about Module 1, Objectives 1 and 2. So without further ado, I will share my screen here and get the lecture going. Okay. So Module 1 is about conceptualization of addictive behavior. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of addictive behavior. These are the objectives or the things that you need to know for this module to do well on the quiz at the end of the module. So I want you to be able to explain the purpose of theories and what makes a good theory, and identify the incongruent views about addiction in the U.S. history and how they compare with views today. We'll talk about those two today. But also in the module, we will compare 3 perspectives on addiction, identifying the advantages and disadvantages of each. And then we're going to detail some DSM-5 diagnoses of addiction, and then we'll talk also about language. So our first objective that we're going to talk about today is to explain the purpose of theories and what makes a good theory. So this might be a little bit of review for you if you've had some other instruction on the scientific method, but I'll talk about it in the case of addiction. So addiction, as it turns out, is really complex. I mean, there are just many ways to explain it, to prevent it, to treat it. And so there are a lot of theories in the field of addiction, maybe more so than in other fields, because what has happened is when we've used one theory, when we've gone on one idea, like, for example, one that you're going to become familiar with, which is that addiction is a disease, right? It's a problem with the brain or with the body. That kind of narrow approach to the field has not produced the best outcomes. You know, it hasn't been the best at dealing with addiction. So we have to look at it from a bunch of different theoretical perspectives to make sense of it and to really get better outcomes. So the more we've kind of seen it as a broader basis of theories, then we've started to get some better outcomes in terms of treatment. So the ideal purpose of a theory is to drive research and effective practice. And we'll see an example of that on the next slide. But theories ideally should be creating hypotheses and creating ways of testing the theory. And then they should also be informing how to treat addiction. Okay, so what's a good theory? First off, what is a theory? A theory is an organized explanation for a set of findings, things that you observe in the world, right? So for example, addiction, right? Theories can help us understand why people get addicted. So it's an idea, an explanation for why does someone get addicted? Then we call that the etiology of addiction. So, for example, disease theory of addiction may say that people get addicted because they have a genetic predisposition or something biological that makes them more vulnerable than those who don't get addicted. If we think in these terms, then once we have an explanation, that should guide research. So, for example, if we believe that addiction is a disease or is biological or has to do with a genetic predisposition, then we can do research to see if it runs in families. And it should also inform prevention and intervention as well. So we'll use an example here of psychodynamic theory. Psychodynamic theory basically says that addiction results from some kind of unresolved conflict you had, usually as a child, past experience, past conflict, past trauma as a child that is unresolved. So if we were going to think in terms of research, we could, for example, take a population and we could measure their past trauma and then measure their substance abuse. And we would guess that those two things should be related, right? And indeed they are in the research. And then in terms of prevention, the theory can also inform prevention in the sense that we could, if we were to prevent trauma or help people work through some of their trauma, that could help their addiction. So you see how now psychodynamic theory is driving both the research and also driving the practice of treating people. And ideally, that's the way it should be. Unfortunately, in the case of addictions, we often don't see that because practice oftentimes does not get influenced by either theory or by research. Okay, so Theories are basically, as I've been explaining, being tested all the time. And when they're tested, they are often modified. So we never say that a theory is proven. We say that theories are always tentative. And that's maybe where the phrase comes, it's just a theory, like, oh, it's not proven or whatever. But a lot of good theories will have a lot of evidence to back them up. So a theory causes us to make some predictions about the world. It drives research in that way. It creates hypotheses. And then we test those hypotheses using experimental methods or some other kinds of studies. And then we get some observations, we get some findings that then if it doesn't exactly support the theory, so maybe trauma is connected to substance abuse, but only for young people, not for older people. Well, then we can modify the theory to say that young people may have unresolved conflict, but not everybody has unresolved conflict or something like that. So we can modify the theory. And a lot of times the theory, is not completely thrown out, but it's modified some when the evidence doesn't line up with the theory. Sometimes theories do get thrown out if they don't have any evidence at all. So that goes back to what makes a good theory. Number one, it should be simple and understandable, yet explain a broad series of events. So notice I talked about disease theory. I talked about psychodynamic theory. I can explain those in one sentence. Now, there's more to it for sure, and we'll get into that in this class. But it's basically simple, and pretty understandable. Hopefully for you. I don't know. I'm hoping so in the way that I explain it. It should generate predictions, like, for example, that substance abuse is going to run in families, or that people with a lot of conflict or trauma during childhood will be those who abuse more. And then and so those hypotheses can then be tested. And because of that, we can find the theory to be false. It can be false if the observations don't line up with the actual theory. It's also modifiable, revisable, right? We can change it. And ultimately, a good theory is going to have a lot of empirical support. A lot of studies are going to say, yeah, this works. Yeah, this works. Yeah, this is a good explanation. Yeah, the data support this. But we never say it's proven, because there could also always be a study that we haven't done that's going to prove it to be wrong. Objective number 2, identify the incongruent views about addiction in U.S. history and how they compare with views today. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of dive into history. For those history lovers like me, you'll love it. Okay, 2 incongruent views. Number 1, people are addicted because they're doing a big F-U to society and F-U to religion. And they're basically saying, I ain't doing all that. They are sinners. They're immoral. They are degenerates. And then a totally different view that says that people who are addicted are diseased. They're victims. They have a loss of control. And we're going to see those views go up and down and up and down and up and down over history. So bear that in mind as we talk about a historical timeline. And here we go, the colonial period. Prior to the establishment of the United States, alcohol consumption was really high. It had been really high also in Europe. And that was about 3 times as high as the amount that people drink alcohol today. So they were drinking a lot. And partly it was because it was pretty much used everywhere. Alcohol was used in medicine very heavily. Lots of drugs use alcohol in work settings. I mean, employers would give you alcohol during work. It's, I know, totally insane for the thing. Jails served alcohol. I mean, it's crazy, right? And of course, socially, taverns were places where people met, and that was kind of like a community center, so to say. And people, almost everybody drank pretty heavily, but people were relatively unconcerned about it. Although it was never cool to be totally drunk in public, but falling down, acting crazy, and doing antisocial things. But otherwise, it's pretty much wasn't really seen as a problem. Okay, so then come the mid to late 1700s, in Britain, they started talking about drunkenness as a dis-ease. And if you think about that, I mean, I pulled apart the word there to look at the prefix. It's like dis-ease, an unease. You are not comfortable. It is a discomfort, because it caused all these other medical problems. So you started seeing like jaundice because people's liver went bad and they were miserable, and they had all kinds of gastrointestinal problems and gout and stuff like that. So, but again, so here we get the start of this sort of disease concept in some ways. In the US, there was a very influential physician named Benjamin Rush. And Dr. Rush was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So he was a fairly popular guy at the time. And he considered alcoholism to be a sort of loss of control, which, would sort of speak to that kind of disease concept. But he also thought that people who were drinking excessive alcohol needed moral reform. They needed to kind of get right with God. He was operating on very Christian principles. There was another guy that was important, who was also a physician, named Thomas Trotter, and he started bringing up the concept that, hey, excessive alcohol use or alcohol use disorder is a medical problem, in fact. So there again, we get that morality and disease there juxtaposed. So come early 1800s, we started seeing and really Benjamin Rush was sort of the start of this. He started talking about temperance. Now, temperance was the idea at the time that we need to cut down on alcohol. And so it focused on moderation of alcohol. Like, you can drink alcohol, but don't drink too much. And in fact, how that was a lot of times accomplished was you drink beer and wine. You don't drink whiskey, because when you drink whiskey, that's when you get really crazy, right? But beer and wine, it was harder to get as much alcohol at once. So it was really focused on moderation. And there were these groups that they called temperance societies, right? Those grew into the 1830s, and they became more and more kind of morally focused during that time. And the focus also changed from you shouldn't drink that much alcohol to you should drink no alcohol, which is what we call abstinence. At this point, now a party started, a political party, prohibitionist movement started to try to make alcohol illegal in the United States. So all of this stuff was seen as addictive. Alcohol, opium, morphine, and for the first times, really, these were starting to be seen as addictive, because they really, like I said, they've very often prescribed medically, even for really like children. If you had a kid with a cough, a lot of times they would just be getting heroin, basically. People took cocaine for, common maladies. Anyway, after the Civil War, all this kind of exploded with opiates, because morphine had been used a lot in pain relief, and now you had a bunch of morphine addicts or opium addicts. And that was interesting because it was viewed differently if you were rich or if you were poor. If you were rich, it was viewed as iatrogenic, which is this idea that it was caused by the physician. The physician prescribed you these opiates, and now you're addicted to opiates. Not your fault. It's the physician's fault. And by the way, I know you see the parallel between today's problem with heroin and fentanyl and other opiates. So But if you were poor, it was seen as a whole different thing, which is that you had moral problems and that you passed along your moral problems to others in your family and in your neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a double standard there if you were rich versus if you were poor. Come 1870, a very important group formed. It was called the American Association for the Cure of Inebriates. And you may say, what is an inebriate? Well, there were all of these terms that were popular around these times, and they kind of went in this order. So the terms changed, and they changed along with the concept of, is it considered to be a moral thing, or is it considered to be a disease thing? And so we had this term called intemperance, and we've talked about temperance, right? And the opposite is intemperance. And that was the idea that excessive alcohol use is considered, the connotation behind that term is that the person was, sinful, was a degenerate, it was an immoral condition. Dipsomania is this idea that it was a heritable medical condition, but it was only really applied to the upper and middle classes, this idea of dipsomania. And then there was inebriety, and if people still say inebriated, right? You might have heard that word. And that's this idea that it's involuntary, like you're not really choosing it, but still there's some immoral stuff behind it, but it's also a medical thing. And then finally people coalesced around the term around that time, around, in the 1920s, alcoholism. And that's this idea that it's a medical condition. It's attributed to the substance alcohol, not to the person, and thus alcohol in the name. So that's interesting. Anyway, alcohol consumption in 1870 is increasing quite rapidly. That had to do a lot with availability and cost. It was just being produced and widely available, and it was low cost. And anyway, this group forms, and their members identify as scientists, and they think of addiction as a curable disease. And they were very, very important in terms of starting treatment centers. And you'll learn more about those as the class goes on. Later on, we see the establishment of state asylums. In the late 1800s, we start to get, well, during the Civil War, the temperance movement kind of was, anyway, shadowed by what was going on with the war, and it kind of died down a little bit. But after the Civil War, we started to see that temperance movement rising up again. And a lot of that was the actions of a lot of women. And women who were also, interestingly enough, working toward the suffragist movement, the right to vote, which happened around the same time as Prohibition. And so we get these women leaders, and it's a very, very strong moral and religious basis. They basically said, look, we're dealing with all this family violence, wives and children getting beat up, and all this violence in community, and all this loss of income, dealing with drinking, and drinking's just got to stop, and we're not able to treat it, and it's not really treatable. So what has to happen, whoops, gotta get my thing up again. What has to happen is that it has to just be not available. We gotta make it illegal. And so from there, we're gonna get the National Prohibition Law. But before that, in 1914, right before we get Prohibition, we get the Harrison Act of 1914. And the Harrison Act regulated narcotics. So regulated opium, heroin, cocaine, and stuff like that. So there we first get the first concept that narcotics, which before were legal, are now illegal. So we start to see that criminalization element in there, that people who use narcotics are immoral and need to be punished. And then we get this zero tolerance for alcohol rising in popularity too. There's like, we are not doing any alcohol, no moderation, no nothing, let's make it unavailable. 1920 comes along, national prohibition. So an amendment to the Constitution was passed that just said, we are banning the production and the sale of all alcohol, period. Now, if you had some, you could drink it, but you couldn't produce it. so you couldn't make any more. And so there were a couple of different ways you could get it. Of course, people bootlegged and made moonshine and all that kind of thing. And physicians could prescribe it because it was still used in medicines. The people thought that alcohol was a poison. Remember the concept of alcoholism and said alcohol's the bad guy, not the person. But then they still thought the person was blameworthy if they drink it, and then they become addicted, and then they're weak-willed or they're immoral or whatever. At this point, no one needed any treatment facilities, right? Because alcohol is illegal. We just said, forget treatment. It doesn't work anyway. We're just going to ban all alcohol. But now, of course, people just went to the doctors and physicians started prescribing alcohol far more than they used to. And so there were ways in which people got it. And because of that, it wasn't hugely effective. So then we see the Great Depression in the 1930s, economic life in the United States just goes way, way down, and job unemployment was way, way up. By 1933, now we see prohibition being repealed. So it went from 1920 to 1933. And so if we look at that period, what we find is that prohibition didn't entirely eliminate drinking. It was just down by about 30%, which is a lot. And it didn't go up again to the pre-prohibition amounts until like the 1970s. So it did have quite a long-lasting impact. Now, it's hard to say why it was repealed, but one of the factors was the economic strain from just loss of tax revenue, because states make a lot of money off sales tax of alcohol, and they didn't have that when alcohol was not being sold. Anyway, 1935 comes around, Alcoholics Anonymous is founded. That's big. And it's big on the concept of disease theory. So here's the idea in Alcoholics Anonymous. They had this theory called the allergy theory. And that says that although lots of people who do not have the allergy, don't take that too seriously, to alcohol, can drink and they're fine, and doesn't even matter if they drink a lot, they still won't become addicted. And then there's some people who become addicted, and those are the people who have the predisposed disease, although it really wasn't very specific what it was. It was called an allergy. It was founded on Christian principles, so there we see that morality thing. But rather than this concept of that the person who's addicted has this immoral behavior and they should be punished, Alcoholics Anonymous said we need to offer support, not punishment, not humiliation. And Alcoholics Anonymous had been the most successful self-help group in the world. Has treated millions of people with alcohol problems. So very, very successful. Come the late 1930s, 1940s, now we're starting to see scientific inquiry coming back. There are centers formed to research substance abuse. This medical and disease approach is now, starting with Alcoholics Anonymous, it's now really going on the rise. Also, psychodynamic explanations, which I talked about earlier, are also very popular. This is, the time of Freudian type explanations. And then come the 1960s, now we start to see civil rights movement and this idea of counterculture, which was a culture that was exploring sexuality, exploring drug use and things like that. So we started to see the increase in other kinds of substances, for example, like hallucinogens and cannabis or marijuana. Although those have been around for a long time, now we're starting to see increases in them. And also, interestingly enough, and this is the first time we got away from, this idea of immorality and the idea of disease, and started talking about some of the socioeconomic factors that might drive addiction, things like poverty, things going on in society that might drive addiction. It was very popular at the time, started to become very popular, and throughout much of the history of treatment, it became very popular to use confrontational approaches. And you might know this from the TV show Intervention or whatever, where you just confront the person with addiction, and you just tell them, you've got to change, you're ruining your life, you're ruining my life. And it's very sometimes aggressive kind of confrontation like that. Now those were becoming very popular at the time. Okay, so I want to say one more word about history of the present to sum it up. Substance use has been consistently seen as both this medical, this disease condition, but also as a moral problem. And we're going to see that continuing in today's views of substance use. So we're going to turn to that next time with objectives 3 and 4. Hope you enjoyed this lecture on module 1, and I hope you're ready to take a quiz. You guys have a great day, and I'll see you later.